Dust rose in lazy clouds, clinging to the sweaty skin of the Mexican soldiers. Captain Marshall Grant watched it all from his horse, a sneer creasing the corner of his mouth. Before him, an old man, Elias Coleman, stood beside a simple well, dug with his own hands decades ago. His shoulders were bowed by the weight of nearly 70 years, but his eyes, a faded blue like the Texas midday sky, still held a spark of defiance. The captain found it amusing. "So, old man, this is your great wealth?" Grant's voice was oily, like rifle grease, slick and dangerous. "A hole in the ground with some dirty water?" The soldiers laughed, a harsh sound that scraped against the ranch's silence. They were young, filled with an easy cruelty that came with the uniform and impunity. To them, Elias was just an obstacle, a stubborn Texan refusing to yield passage, and his well's water to the patrol. "That water isn't dirty, Captain," Elias replied, his voice steady, though low. "It's quenched my family's thirst for 2 generations. It's clean, and it's mine." The word "mine" hung in the hot air. Grant dismounted slowly, the jingle of his spurs a metallic omen. He walked to the edge of the well, spat into it, and turned back to Elias, his face inches from the old man's. "Nothing here is yours, viejo. This land, this water, it all belongs to Mexico, and we take what we need. But today, I'm feeling generous. We won't just take, we'll leave a lesson." With a nod, he gave the order. 2 soldiers brought forth a heavy canvas sack. The acrid smell of lime and something chemical fouled the air. Elias understood what was about to happen, and a chill snaked down his spine, a chill the searing sun couldn't warm. This wasn't about water. It was about power, about breaking a man's spirit. "No, please, it will kill the land. It will kill my livestock." Elias's plea was met with more laughter. The sack was emptied into the well. The water bubbled, turning milky and foul. The sound of that poison mixing with his family's lifeblood was worse than a gunshot. It was the slow death of everything he had built. Elias closed his eyes, and for a moment he was no longer there. He was years in the past, sitting on the porch with his late wife. She had been watching the road, observing the first Mexican patrols that were beginning to become more frequent. "There's something different about these men, Elias," she had said. "It's not the look of soldiers, it's the look of owners." He had squeezed her hand and told her not to worry. That decency was a universal language. How foolish he had been. Decency had borders, and they had crossed them. When he opened his eyes, the soldiers were remounting their horses, still laughing. Captain Grant looked at Elias one last time, triumph etched on his face. "Remember this, old man. Texas learns from pain." They rode off, leaving Elias alone with the silence, the dust, and a poisoned well. The old man walked to its edge, the smell of death rising to meet him. He didn't cry. The pain he felt was too deep for tears. It was an ancient pain, a pain that settled in the bones and whispered of injustice. He looked toward the horizon, towards the distant hills that seemed to shimmer with heat. The captain and his men thought they had won, that they had crushed an insignificant old man. But they didn't know what they had just awakened. The desert wind, carrying the sound of their receding hooves, also seemed to carry a whisper, a name that was more prayer than word, a name that echoed from the Alamo. If you believe cruelty can reign forever, wait and see what happens when a good man's honor is poisoned. Injustice, like poisoned water, spread quickly. Within days, Elias's few head of cattle grew sick. 2 died. He was forced to haul his buckets to the small settlement miles away to fetch water. Each trip was a procession of humiliation. People saw him, old Elias Coleman, who had always been a pillar of self-sufficiency, now reduced to begging for the most basic necessity. Worse still, Grant's soldiers had spread their own version of the story. In the town saloon, they told, between slugs of cheap whiskey, that the old Texan was mad, that he had poisoned his own well to gain sympathy or perhaps to blame the Mexican army and incite a rebellion. Fear was a more potent poison than lime. Elias's neighbors, once friends who shared bread and stories, now averted their gaze. They offered him water, yes, but with a nervous haste, as if his presence might contaminate them with the same misfortune. Elias was alone, an island of dishonor on his own land. Captain Marshall Grant reveled in his power. He saw himself not just as an officer, but as a tamer of that wild territory and its stubborn people. From his makeshift command post in town, he issued new orders, requisitioning land, confiscating supplies, and treating the Texan settlers with arrogant disdain. Elias Coleman's humiliation had only been the beginning, a test to see how far he could push, and the answer was very far. No one dared challenge him. His arrogance grew daily, fueled by the community's silence and fear. He firmly believed that force was the only law those rough pioneers understood, and he was the force. He was the law. Elias felt the weight of every glance, of every door that closed a little faster as he passed. Night was the worst part. In the stillness of his home, he would sit in the darkness, the phantom laughter of the soldiers echoing in his mind. It was on one of these nights that the memory came, not like a dream, but as clear and vivid as the day it happened. He was a boy, no more than 10 years old. His father had taken him to town for a rally. A tall man of simple manners, but with a presence that seemed to fill the entire square, was speaking. He wasn't a soft-spoken politician. He was a frontiersman, dressed in buckskin, and his name was Davy Crockett. During the speech, a wealthy man, a land speculator, had tried to interrupt him, mocking his clothes and his accent. The crowd fell silent, expecting an outburst. But Crockett didn't shout. He simply paused, looked at the man, and with cutting calm, dissected the fellow's hypocrisy and greed with words as sharp as a hunting knife. He didn't use force, he used truth. And the crowd, which had feared the rich man before, now laughed at him. On that day, Elias's father had told him, "Son, remember this. True strength isn't in the fist that strikes, but in the spine that doesn't bend." The promise Elias had made to himself was not to fight, but to live with that same integrity on this land for which men like Crockett were willing to die. Sitting there in the darkness of his desecrated home, Elias realized that Captain Grant hadn't just poisoned his water, he had tried to poison his soul, to make him feel weak, old, and powerless. But the memory of Crockett, the recall of his father's lesson, ignited something within him. The pain gave way to a cold clarity. The humiliation gave way to a quiet determination. He began to rise earlier. He spent hours not tending to his dying livestock, but observing. Hidden behind the rocks that dotted his land, he watched Grant's patrols. He noted the laziness in their routines, the arrogance that made them careless. He jotted down the times the supply wagon passed, always on the same road, always with the same negligent escort. He no longer looked like a broken man. He looked like a hunter. The captain didn't know it, but by setting foot on that ranch, he had just awakened the wrong man. The change in Elias Coleman was so subtle, no one noticed. He still walked to town for water, but his shoulders weren't as bowed anymore. His gaze was no longer that of a victim. It was that of a man with a purpose. He began to act, not with a rifle, but with the cunning of someone who knew every stone and every shadow of his land. He spent his days mapping the soldiers' movements, not on paper, but in his mind. He knew which trails they avoided out of laziness, which watchposts grew sleepy under the afternoon sun. He wasn't planning a battle. He was looking for a fracture in Captain Grant's armor of arrogance. His search led him to one of the few people in town who didn't fear him, but looked at him with a bitter understanding: Abigail Sutton Whitaker. Abigail was a widow whose husband, a man of short temper and large heart, had been killed in a dispute with Grant's men 6 months prior. Since then, she had run the small-town general store with a cold efficiency. Her grief transformed into a steely resolve. She had seen what they did to Elias, and in his humiliation, she saw a mirror of her own loss. Elias sought her out on a moonless night, rapping softly on the back door of the general store. At first, Abigail hesitated. Helping him was dangerous. But when he explained his plan, not a plan of bloody revenge, but of justice, she saw the same fire her husband possessed, the fire of Texan stubbornness. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice steady. "Information," Elias replied. "Grant is arrogant, and arrogant men are greedy. I want to know what he does when he thinks no one is looking." Abigail became his eyes and ears in town. Through the conversations she overheard in the general store, through the unusual requests for certain supplies made by officers, she began to piece together a puzzle. Soon, they discovered Grant's weak spot. He was stealing from his own army. He was diverting gunpowder, medicine, and food to sell to smugglers on the border. The injustice he inflicted on the Texans was merely a smokescreen to cover his own crimes. The proof they needed came from Elias. Following the supply wagon's route, he found what he was looking for in a spot where the wagon always stopped, hidden by a small ravine. Lying in the dust, as if fate had placed it there, was a page from a ledger. On it, hurried notes detailed a transaction of military goods at a price far below the official value. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable: Captain Marshall Grant. With the proof in hand, the plan took shape. They couldn't simply turn it over to local command, which was loyal to Grant. They needed to reach someone higher up, someone who would see Grant's corruption as a stain on the Mexican Army's honor. But how? Sending a messenger was too risky. That night, as Elias and Abigail discussed their few dangerous options in his barn, under the light of a lantern, the sound of an approaching horse made them freeze. A soldier? Had Grant discovered something? Elias blew out the flame, plunging them into darkness. The sound of footsteps stopped outside. The barn door creaked open, revealing a silhouette against the starry sky. It wasn't a soldier. The man was tall, wore a hunting coat, and carried a long rifle with the familiarity of a third limb. He paused at the entrance, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. "They say Captain Grant's been drowning. Men's honor around here." The voice was a low thunder, full of gravel and authority. "I also heard an old man named Elias Coleman decided he wasn't going to drown with them." Elias and Abigail fell silent, stunned. The stranger took a step into the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wood. His face was a map of rivers and mountains, weathered by sun and time, a face known in every corner of the frontier. "My name is Crockett," he said with a slight smile. "Davy Crockett. I heard justice in Texas is in need of a little help." Davy Crockett's arrival was not like a storm, but like the calm that precedes it. He didn't bring an army, nor promises of a pitched battle. He brought something far more powerful, a living legend and a strategic mind honed by frontier life. He listened intently to Elias and Abigail's plan, examining the ledger page under the lantern light. A slow nod was his only initial comment. He saw not just an old farmer and a widow seeking revenge, he saw the heart of Texas, wounded but still beating. "Your plan is good, Elias," Crockett said finally, his voice filling the small barn, "but you're aiming at the wrong target. Sending this to some run-of-the-mill general is a toss of the dice. We need the right general." Crockett knew the men who commanded the Mexican army. He knew their rivalries, their ambitions, and, most importantly, their weaknesses. There was a general named Montoya, known for his rigid code of honor and his deep disdain for officers who enriched themselves at the Army's expense. Montoya and Grant belonged to opposing factions within the military hierarchy. For Montoya, proof of Grant's treachery would not be a problem. It would be an opportunity. The plan was refined. It would no longer be about sending a message. It would be about setting a stage. Abigail, using her contacts at the general store, spread a carefully crafted rumor. She spoke of a new powerful buyer from the north, interested in acquiring a large quantity of military supplies, no questions asked. The price was high, and payment would be in gold. The bait was cast into the current of Grant's greed, and he bit without hesitation. Through intermediaries, a meeting was arranged. The chosen location was a secluded canyon several miles from Grant's post, a perfect spot for a clandestine transaction. Blinded by the promise of gold, Grant ordered a significant portion of the fort's supplies diverted to the rendezvous. It was his largest and boldest illegal operation yet. On the appointed night, under a pale moon, Captain Marshall Grant waited at the bottom of the canyon, surrounded by laden wagons and a handful of his most loyal and corrupt men. The arrogance on his face was almost palpable. He was about to secure his fortune. But instead of the sound of a buyer's caravan, he heard the rhythmic trot of approaching military cavalry. Confused, he turned, expecting one of his own patrols. From the shadows of the canyon, no smugglers emerged. A delegation of Mexican officers appeared, their immaculate uniforms gleaming in the moonlight. At their head, mounted on a black stallion, was General Montoya. His face was a mask of contained fury. Grant's smile froze and then shattered. The blood drained from his face. Fear, an emotion he delighted in inflicting on others, now consumed him. He looked around desperately like a cornered animal. His men, sensing the trap, dropped their weapons. The game was up. Montoya dismounted, walking slowly towards Grant. One of his aides handed him a single piece of paper, the ledger page Elias had found. Montoya held it before Grant's face. "Treason, Captain. Stealing from the army that gave you this uniform?" The general's voice was low, but each word was a blow. Grant couldn't reply. In that moment, he lost everything: his power, his rank, his freedom. Before his own men and a superior who despised him, he was stripped of his authority. Montoya ripped the insignia from Grant's uniform with a violent tug. From a ridge above, watching the scene unfold, were Elias, Abigail, and Crockett. There were no shouts of victory, only a solemn silence. Justice hadn't come from the barrel of a rifle, but from the quiet fall of a man under the weight of his own crimes. As Grant was bound and led away like a common prisoner, Crockett placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Justice has many voices, my friend. Sometimes it shouts. Other times, like today, it simply whispers the truth." The sun began to rise, painting the Texas sky with hues of orange and purple. When the townsfolk awoke and saw their tyrant being led away in chains, there was no boisterous celebration. There was something deeper. Men silently removed their hats, a gesture of respect, not for Grant's downfall, but for the quiet courage of the old man who refused to be broken. Here, where fear had reigned, the wind now blew free, as if Texas itself had breathed a sigh of relief. In the months that followed, life in the small settlement slowly returned to its rhythm. Elias Coleman's well was cleaned. The community, freed from Captain Grant's fear, came in force to help. The same neighbors who had once averted their gaze now worked side by side with him, clearing out the poisoned water and digging deeper until they found a new source, cleaner and stronger than before. Elias held no grudges. He understood that fear could make good men act with weakness. His victory needed no applause, only the peace that had settled back upon his lands. He was no war hero, but he had fought a battle for his community's soul and won with honor and intelligence. News of Marshal Grant's fate arrived months later, brought by a merchant. He had been tried by court-martial, found guilty of treason and theft, and sentenced to a lifetime of hard labor in a military prison in the heart of Mexico. His name was erased from the records with dishonor. He, who so valued power and prestige, became a ghost, forgotten by all, reaping exactly what he had sown, a life of humiliation in a dark cell. Davy Crockett departed as quietly as he had arrived. Before leaving, he shared one last cup of coffee with Elias on the porch of the rebuilt home. "Texas isn't just this land, Elias," Crockett said, looking towards the hills. "It's the courage of people like you, people who plant, who build, and refuse to let hate poison the soil. That's the fight that matters." Elias never saw him again, but Crockett's presence remained, not as a savior, but as a reminder that a man's strength is not measured by his ability to inflict pain, but by his resilience in the face of injustice. Freedom, he learned, was not something won once and for all on bloody battlefields, but something defended every day in small acts of decency and unwavering courage. Those who fight with faith and honor, even if silently, are never forgotten. Years later, Elias Coleman's ranch became a stopping point for travelers. The water from his well was famed throughout the county for being the purest and sweetest. And as they drank, the travelers would hear the story of how the Mexican army mocked an old man, not knowing they were mocking the very spirit of Texas. The story of how an ordinary man, with the help of a legend, proved that true strength lies not in the sword, but in a soul that refuses to be poisoned. He tried to destroy that man, but ended up destroying himself. In Texas, true revenge is living free when your enemy lives bound by the chains of his own past. If this story of honor, courage, and the true Texan spirit moved you, subscribe to our channel. Share this video with everyone who is proud of their roots and believes that justice, even if it takes time, always finds its way. And don't forget to comment from which city or state you're watching. We want to know how far the pride of freedom reaches.